Warning. This video essay contains spoilers for Andrei Rublev, Jeanne Dielman 23 Quadricommerce 1080 Brussels, and the Seventh Continent. The topics presented in this essay may be disturbing to some viewers. Here are the first moments of Tetris. These first moments are pretty much always the same. Of course, the blocks are randomized, but there's always blocks. Sure, the blocks will eventually speed up, but they always speed up. You expect the blocks to speed up. But something happens to me when I play Tetris. Maybe it happens to you too. For the first few moments of the slow familiar, I sometimes get a little bored. Well, maybe bored isn't the right word. Maybe the word is stillness or contentment. As I've gotten older, I've gotten more comfortable in moments of stillness. And I've come to crave them. A block appears, you rotate it, and you fit it into your perfect structure. Nice, orderly, safe. But then, of course, the blocks speed up. You go from bored, or still, to alert. You're in the flow state now. You've gone beneath the surface and you've dived down into the other place. Not bored, but not stressed. Not comfortable either. This place turns off your brain to all other things, all sense of time, all sense of responsibility. Then the game continues to get faster and faster and faster. Even though you've played dozens or hundreds of hours, you still dread the speed of those blocks, those tetraminos. They're getting faster and you're not. You're slowing down. You've been slowing down for years. This game that a few minutes ago promised you endless comfort will now end. It will end. A few years ago, I started watching YouTube videos focused on people completing chores, mowing lawns, restoring old tools, cleaning houses. I'd watch these videos for hours at the height of the pandemic, sitting passively and letting these other people's routines wash over me. Most of these videos get clicks based on the level of chaos the cleaner or mower or restorer is entering into. Hyperbolic titles like "Worst Overgrown Yard Ever Gets Massive Makeover" or "Rusty Garbage Gets Sandblasted Back to Life." These videos sound like tense battles between people and nature, but they're really just people doing chores. And you know that by the end of the video, the chore will be done. These videos help me fall asleep, or they play in the background while I work, or they utterly transfix me in moments of great anxiety. And I'm not alone. These aren't small, obscure channels, but instead huge communities, sometimes going into the millions. Every video in each genre is essentially the exact same video. Like Tetris, we may be getting randomized blocks, but the game is always the same. The video starts with a yard or a car or a house or a tool that seems impossible to clean or fix or restore, but in just a few time-lapsed minutes, that chaos is brought to order. Through montage, the entropy of the universe is controlled. I've been a high school teacher for 10 years, and in that time I've learned that perhaps more than anything else, people crave structure and routine. There's safety in the familiar. And in an increasingly connected world where each day feels less safe than the day before, that need for structure only gets stronger. Students enter the space of a classroom with enormous anxiety, bringing with them the baggage of broken homes, fear of the unknown, fear of their own bodies, fear of each other. Part of a teacher's job is to create a place of stillness, not literally, not always, but the safety that comes with stillness. With the order routine instills into the chaos of life. We fear change. That's not a profound statement, but it bears appraisal when things get particularly chaotic. Throughout history, in times of great upheaval, change, or uncertainty, people have clung to what they know best, dug in their heels, and trusted that routine would help them through. During the pandemic, when I taught from my kitchen on Zoom, I had a conversation with my students each morning about what they were doing to find stillness in their lives. Dozens of them told me they had been playing Animal Crossing. So I bought Animal Crossing, hopped on a plane, and moved to Xanadu. Each morning, before I taught students over Zoom, which I had to learn how to use over a weekend when the school year unexpectedly shifted to an online space, I would visit Xanadu, dig up fossils, scour the beaches, talk to my friends, and create pixel art. Then I would turn on my computer and spend several hours talking to students who were more alone than they had ever been in their lives, many of them dealing with mental illness, difficult home lives they couldn't escape, or crushing isolation. After that, I would turn on YouTube and watch a guy from some Scandinavian country restore a gumball machine that had rusted over time. During these months, as I slowly filled out the Natural History Museum of Xanadu and watched hundreds of tools get restored, I couldn't get my own adolescence out of my mind. Like most people, my teenage years were fraught with change, uncertainty, upheaval, and fear. I spent a lot of time by myself in those years, and there were far fewer opportunities for distraction in digital spaces than there are now. But I did have a library card, and I did have access to a wide variety of obscure and international movies through which to escape. In those years, I found the cinematic equivalent to Tetris in restoration videos. I found something called slow cinema. Depending on who you ask, slow cinema can be a multitude of things. It could be described as enigmatic, contemplative, or spiritual, but it could just as easily be called boring or even anti-audience. The term slow cinema was coined around the turn of the 21st century. Though it's unclear who exactly coined it, film critic Michael Chiment or Jonathan Romney. While this term wasn't used until recently, it could be used to describe film movements dating all the way back to the beginning of the silent era. Slow cinema is no different from other art movements in that they usually aren't called anything until they've been around for a long time. Take film noir, one of the most famous and certainly one of the most immediately identifiable film movements. It wasn't until the 60s or 70s when neo-noir films like Chinatown were being released that people collectively looked back at the crime films of the 40s and 50s and saw the patterns of style which had emerged over time. The shadows, the femme fatales, the bleak endings, the nihilism. These filmmakers weren't consciously making film noir in the early days, at least not a lot of them. They were making crime films, and in this era, that's just what crime films looked like, sounded like, felt like. Just like film noir, it's impossible to determine who the first slow cinema director was or what the first slow cinema film was, but we can see shades of the movement as far back as the early 19-teens. Japanese director Yosujiro Ozu could be considered one of our oldest and most prolific filmmakers to establish the style of slow cinema. So, what is that style? The nebulous nature of defining an art movement can lead to endless arguments over semantics, but the basic defining characteristics of slow cinema are long takes, much longer than the current American 3-second average, a lack of central propulsive narrative focus, a lack of non-diegetic music, or, in other words, there's no original score or soundtrack to speak of, and a heightening of the mundane. But these rules are loose. Just like there are vibrant Technicolor film noir examples, there are examples of slow cinema which include something of a narrative focus or the occasional fast edit or the use of non-diegetic music. These filmmakers aren't, or mostly aren't, consciously making slow cinema films. They're making films which people in their audience will sometimes call slow cinema. The three films we'll be looking at today share a similar theme regarding time and our existential relationship to it, but slow cinema can be about anything. For example, Yosujiro Ozu's gorgeous Technicolor masterpiece, Good Morning, is a family comedy about a suburban group of boys who become obsessed with their neighbor's house because they own a TV, and with that TV they can watch sumo wrestling. One of the subplots is about a boy who can fart on command, and how he teaches the other boys to also fart on command. What makes this film part of the slow cinema canon is not the plot, but the method of delivery. Ozu's long takes, his static camera, and minimal narrative push allow the film to feel less like a manufactured thing and more like a window into a specific kind of life where these characters are not performing a drama for an audience, but instead just living in front of us. One of the main qualities that makes a film slow cinema is its seeming indifference to the audience. In Good Morning, you get the sense that Ozu found these people just living this life, and you've been given the opportunity to live vicariously through them in a manner closer to documentary than straight narrative fiction. Similarly, in the films of Thai director Arpishatkon Wiranthakul, narrative is nearly non existent. Instead, his films rely on the textures and feelings of spaces to communicate their main ideas. For example, in his 2015 Cemetery of Splendor, Wirathakul's camera quietly observes a room filled with men who have been overcome by a strange plague of sleep. They're attached to machines which express the dreams of the men through colored LED lights. The protagonist, if you can call her that, is able to psychically communicate with these men and the spirits they conjure. To describe the plot of Cemetery of Splendor is to rob it of its textural qualities, and to refer to the film as a piece of slow cinema is to diminish its spiritual essence. Cemetery of Splendor is a space of quiet contemplation and existential rumination. The film isn't a story, but a place. It's an environment you can retire to in a time of restlessness, more akin to a temple than a narrative film production. In this way, Cemetery of Splendor is more reminiscent of a digital space than a feature film. Watching the film is like jumping into the world of Animal Crossing. The story isn't the draw, but it's instead something more esoteric and difficult to communicate. You go there because of the way it makes you feel and because of the work you get to do, introspectively, in your own mind. What draws millions of people to Animal Crossing is the lack of expectation from the game itself. It's a playground, a space that you can visit another life within, free of the immediate anxieties and consequences and expectations of modern life. In a time of chaos and uncertainty, it's these spaces that can be the most healing. Slow cinema spaces like those of Cemetery of Splendor offer the calming and ruminative environments our minds need for contemplation and restoration. Perhaps the most famous and most seen example of slow cinema would be Stanley Kubrick's 1968 science fiction film 2001: A Space Odyssey. The film features little dialogue, most of which is just benign chatter, and the foreground elements are mostly non-narrative. It's nearly 2 hours into the film when any semblance of traditional plot actually emerges, and even that is abstracted by the more environmental and experiential elements of what the movie is doing. However, in contrast to the spiritual nature of Cemetery of Splendor, 2001: A Space Odyssey allows darker observations about our place in the universe, the cycles of life, and ultimately the consequences of unethical progress. The opening 40 minutes, free of dialogue or even a clear story structure, allow the audience to observe events without overt narrative commentary. But the language of the editing and the placement of the camera suggest we are not meant to relate to these characters. Instead, the cinematic language suggests we are something more similar to the AI villain, HAL 9000, with our static gaze and disinterest in their lives. Kubrick's film is sometimes referred to as a cold observation on the subject of mankind, and the film language here communicates our isolation from the events as viewers on the outside. If Cemetery of Splendor is a welcoming temple of spiritual contemplation, then 2001: A Space Odyssey is a diorama in the Museum of Natural History, allowing us to observe from afar and never fully understand the subjects in which we're here to see. Kubrick's directorial choices in 2001: A Space Odyssey lend the film its otherworldly qualities. While you can call the film science fiction, it could just as easily be categorized as a horror film or an art film or a travelogue or a piece of philosophical speculative fiction. Ultimately, Kubrick's cinematic language in 2001: A Space Odyssey places it into the world of slow cinema. Even though one of its most famous qualities is non-diegetic classical music, The rules are loose when it comes to these categories, and the long takes, observational nature of the camera angles, and foregrounding of texture and space over traditional narrative structure make this perhaps the most watched and most famous example of slow cinema. The films we will be talking about today are only three examples of a subgenre which spans decades, genres, and international borders, but they all share a specific use of the slow cinema aesthetic to regard the passing of time as a prison from which none of us can escape. Andrei Tarkovsky is one of the most influential directors in the slow cinema movement. On paper, Tarkovsky's 1966 film Andrei Rublev is an epic biographical historical war film, but in execution, Tarkovsky created a meditative spiritual film about the constant flow of time, a film that feels more like a location than a story. Instead of leaning into the narrative of Rublev's life, Tarkovsky instead stitches together vignettes from across a lifetime, which sometimes hardly involve Rublev at all. In fact, about halfway through the movie, Rublev takes a vow of silence and never speaks again. The film acts more on vibes than story, and it focuses more on conversation than action. In a film which is ostensibly about the life of a great, famous artist, we never actually see him paint anything, and we rarely hear him talk at all for much of the runtime. Like an art house Forrest Gump, it's the historical context and the political figures which surround him that make Andrei Rublev the center of this film. Not so much who is Andrei Rublev, but when is Andrei Rublev. The film runs for 205 minutes, it's in black and white, and it's in Russian. So, many contemporary American audiences may already be put off by the very idea of watching it, but when I was 15, Andrei Rublev was my favorite movie. Its complex themes of faith and mortality resonated with me in a time where a close friend died unexpectedly, and the conversations regarding fate and destiny were perfectly suited to the typical teenage questions about the unknown future that I always had. I had never seen anything like it before. I didn't understand at that time that the film existed as part of a long cinematic tradition or that it influenced several changes in film language that we still see today. I just thought, wow, this movie's really chill. It's really comforting. I'd recently moved to a new town. My family was experiencing a lot of hardship. I was trying to make new friends and navigate classes, and here was this movie, which, for over 3.5 hours, changed the nature of how you experience time. For its first, roughly 3 hours, Andrei Rublev is not a story. Like Cemetery of Splendor or Animal Crossing, Andrei Rublev is a space for introspection and solitude. The meditative tempo of the film washes over the audience in long, languid camera movements, which focus more on location than character. You are sucked into these spaces as a silent partner. You're given access to the thoughts and musings of Rublev as he interacts with a cast of characters, like a more conversational version of a Homeric epic. The film has no central plot or narrative push, but is instead a slow building of ideas, philosophies, and religious inquiries. Tarkovsky doesn't even seem to care if you're paying attention, and it's common for viewers to nod off throughout the film, wake up, and then continue watching. Because of the lack of traditional narrative, you wouldn't even be missing much. In fact, nodding off might be part of the dreamlike quality this film exudes. Similar to 2001: A Space Odyssey, the only semblance of traditional narrative only arrives in its final act, which appropriately takes us back to Tetris. After 3 hours of comfortable contemplation, the blocks of story speed up. In this section of the film, the central character is a teenage boy named Boriska. When the prince of the region sends men to Boriska's home, they're looking for his father, an expert bell maker. But they soon realize Boriska is the only survivor in his family after a plague has ravaged the area. When the men express their disappointment that the church, an enormous architectural, financial, and political undertaking, won't have a bell, Boriska assures the men that his father taught him all the secrets of bell making. In fact, Boriska says, he is the only person in Russia still alive who knows how to make a church bell at the size they are describing. So begins a genuinely compelling and suspenseful sequence where Boriska follows his instincts, contradicts men twice his age, and risks his life to create a giant church bell. After 3 hours of stillness, we are finally entering the flow state of narrative. The sequence is totally engrossing, and as we get closer and closer to the creation of the bell, something hits the audience. Oh no, you think. This movie's going to end. Just a few minutes ago, for many viewers, it was like the film would never end, like it would just keep going on and on forever. But now, nearly 4 hours later, Tarkovsky has performed the same trick as a good game of Tetris. He has sped the blocks up, and all of a sudden, we can't maintain the routine. The comfort is gone. It's all going to come crashing down. We are succumbing to time. Time has caught up with us. The story of Andrei Rublev is the story of time itself. Rublev is an iconographer, a painter of Jesus and the saints, icons which still exist, evidenced by the epilogue of the film. Rublev's pursuit is one of permanence, of immortality. He wants to live forever. Rublev's strained relationship with the monks in his life comes from his desire to be taken seriously as an artist, not just some anonymous monk. The religious men in his life push back against his ego. They remind him that only God is immortal, that Rublev must one day grow old and die. The final act of Andrei Rublev foregrounds a new character, a young man who also strives for immortality through his own creation, a creation ostensibly made for God. But Boriska, like Rublev, has to one day grow old. What better symbol for the passing of time than a giant church bell? The film wants you to be aware of time. In a sense, it is asking you to be bored, to feel time passing, to question your own mortality and your own potential legacy. Some critics have pushed back on the term slow cinema, and I tend to agree. It seems pejorative somehow to call a movie like Andrei Rublev slow. Film critic Harry Tuttle calls this movement contemplative cinema, focusing not on the speed of the films, but instead on what the films are most commonly trying to convey. Slow cinema insinuates boredom, while contemplative cinema insinuates something closer to the intent of these films. They want you to think about not only the film itself, but the many ideas and applications they can have for you and your own life. So that being said, let's talk about two of the scariest movies I've ever seen. Jeanne Dielman, 23 Quota-Commerce 1080 Bruxelles, which we will refer to as Jeanne Dielman from now on because of my terrible Belgian pronunciation, is a Belgian film released in 1975 by director Chantal Akerman. While this film rested comfortably as a little-seen masterpiece for decades, it experienced an explosion of interest when, in 2022, Sight and Sound magazine surprised film nerds everywhere and named it as the greatest film of all time in its top 100 list, usurping Alfred Hitchcock's Vertigo as the best film of all time. Jeanne Dielman inspired a lot of annoying discourse on film Twitter, and the Sight and Sound list has unfairly brought a lot of negative attention to it, which is a shame, because Jeanne Dielman is a true masterpiece, which somehow combines the cinematic language of slow cinema with elements of horror and suspense to staggering effect. Ackerman's film somehow combines the vicarious pleasures and comforts of restoration and cleaning videos with the spatial contemplation of Animal Crossing. But then, as it goes on, Jeanne Dielman starts to reveal the anxiety of the final moments of Tetris. It's a testament to Akerman that she's able to elicit not only the hypnotic comfort of these videos many decades before their popularity, and hint at the psychological soothingness that they provide, but she's also able to weaponize these very qualities to defamiliarize the comfort of our own homes and lives in the process. Jeanne Dielman takes place almost entirely at the titular address and is made up of long takes of Jeanne Dielman performing her daily tasks alone. The film is roughly split into 3 parts, which consist of 1 day each. In the first day, we watch Dielman cook, clean, shop, and bathe in mostly real time. Some shots linger for over 10 minutes as we watch Dielman prepare a meal, shine shoes, or brew coffee. The first day or section of the film is hypnotic and captivating for those who enjoy watching tasks get completed and completed well. The cinematic language of this first day is eerily similar to the kinds of videos we see getting millions of hits on YouTube. Like Andrei Rublev before it, Jeanne Dielman disregards narrative structure and foregrounds time itself. There's almost a documentary or voyeuristic quality to what we're seeing in this opening hour. It's so non-verbal and runs for so long that you begin to feel like you're watching a real person performing their real chores in their real house. And because the actions are happening in real time, you kind of are. Dielman is so precise and systematic in the first hour that her actions and the ways she goes about them are enough to keep you interested, even without a strong narrative through line. To put it another way, instead of one narrative, we have several small ones, like here's Jeanne Dielman making coffee, here she is prepping dinner, here she is cleaning, here she is eating. When the afternoon finally arrives, we watch Dielman place a towel on her bed. That's when we find out that, as part of her daily routine, she's also been working as a call girl out of her apartment. The revelation is underplayed like the rest of the film. It's just another part of her daily grind. Jeanne Dielman is a fascinating study in time. Like Andrei Rublev before it, the boredom is kind of the point. Look how much time she spends in her kitchen providing for others. Look how much she cooks and cleans and serves. Her entire day is in the service of men. Once her client leaves the apartment, her son arrives home from school. The rest of her night is spent serving her son. The character, Jeanne Dielman, only exists in this world to please others, and the only reason we know that at all is because Ackerman has decided to make this film about her. When she does leave her house, she's alone. When she's inside her house, she works tirelessly all day to make sure it always looks exactly the same. The long takes, the 201-minute runtime, the silence of the protagonist, all of these choices by Ackerman serve the primary theme of the film. Jeanne Dielman's time, Jeanne Dielman's life, is not hers. She's boxed into this crushing, claustrophobic thing that she has to live. She has no control. Chantal Akerman was only 25 years old at the time of the film's release. She dedicated the movie to her mother, saying that Dielman is a love film for my mother. It gives recognition to that kind of woman. Ackerman further says, the film is a reaction to a hierarchy of images in cinema that places a car accident or a kiss higher in the hierarchy than washing up. And it's not by accident, but relates to the place of woman in the social hierarchy. A woman's work comes out of oppression, and whatever comes out of oppression is more interesting. You have to be definite. You have to be. Ackerman's film gives voice to oppression by forcing the audience to experience life from the perspective of a person in a servile role. But then the movie changes. At the start of the second day, Dielman has another gentleman caller, and then we begin the cycle all over again. But this time, something's different. Something's off. The clockwork precision of Dielman's actions have slipped. She drops a brush. She overcooks her potatoes. She misses a button when she's getting dressed. These are small things. But Ackerman never really reveals what happened in the bedroom on the second morning. It's enough to send Dielman into some sort of downward spiral. We watch as she transforms throughout the second day in only the ways a close friend or a family member would even notice. But because we were with her yesterday, and because we spent so much time observing her as she performed and completed her tasks, we see these small changes that hint toward trauma. Something awful has happened, and we are trapped as helpless observers. There's a purgatorial quality to Jeanne Dielman. Its repetitive structure, its use of long takes, its lack of narrative drive makes you lose track of the larger picture and just live moment to moment with this character. She rarely speaks or emotes in any way and instead communicates almost wholly through her rote actions. In the mid 1970s, cinema was exploding with maximalist intensity. Budgets were ballooning, and charismatic movie stars and special effects were creating the rules for the modern blockbuster. Like Tetris, this movie is more essentialist or minimalist, letting its audience kind of organically find its own narrative within the deceptively simple confines of its space. Ackerman's confidence in her restraint makes the claustrophobia of Dielman's life palpable for her audience. To quote novelist and essayist Jhumpa Lahiri, at a certain point you realize, oh my god, this film is going to end, and I can't bear it. There's something about watching the film that I feel like is so compelling and so seductive, and yet it is so painful to watch the way she has structured her time. I think the whole movie's about time. It's about nothing but time. It's about what to do with time when you don't really have a life to live. In 1975, the only way to see this movie would be in a movie theater without any of the distractions of modern life. You are meant to be fully immersed in the mundanity of Dielman's world, and your mind should be just as wandering as the characters must be. For a person as seemingly busy as Dielman is, she performs the same tasks in the same order each day, giving her all the time in the world to obsess over the events of the second morning. By the time the third day arrives, Dielman's routine life has been fully upended. Her mind wanders, her chores are neglected, and she sits quietly in her kitchen eating a sandwich as the baby she's supposed to be watching cries in another room. The third day is spent in stillness. Like her body won't allow her to continue this life after what has happened. She can't process anything or even complete basic tasks. That afternoon, Dielman receives another male client, gets dressed, and then murders him with a pair of scissors. We don't know why she does this, but we kind of also know exactly why she does this. A game of Tetris isn't lost because of one mistake, it's lost by a dozen mistakes or more, little things that eventually overwhelm us. The shocking violence at the end of Jeanne Dielman surprises the audience as a rare nugget of blunt narrative amidst the docudrama, but it also has a certain inevitability to it. The precision of Dielman's actions throughout the film are mirrored by the choices of the director, who stages each scene with long, unmoving camera angles that never follow the characters. A year before Martin Scorsese allowed his camera to wander away from Travis Bickle throughout Taxi Driver, Chantal Akerman performed the same trick by trapping her audience in various fixed positions, unfeeling and uncaring for the character within the frame. Jeanne Dielman isn't a horror film because of its one scene of violence, but it is instead horrific in the way it manipulates time, both for Jeanne Dielman and for the audience. Akerman lulls the viewer into a state of meditation, contemplation, and comfort, but then she slowly strips the audience of those things. By the end of the film, we are left with a lingering shot of Dielman sitting at her dining room table, covered in blood as inscrutable as ever. But we are right there with her. "14 years later, Austrian filmmaker Michael Haneke's debut feature film would premiere at the Cannes Film Festival, cementing his status as the creator of some of the most disturbing films ever made. At only 100 minutes, Michael Haneke's The Seventh Continent is a relatively breezy affair when compared to the 200-plus minutes of Jeanne Dielman or Andrei Rublev. But don't let the more approachable runtime fool you. The Seventh Continent is by far the most confrontational film on this list. In terms of structure and setting, The Seventh Continent shares several similarities with Jeanne Dielman. Both films focus their attention primarily within the upper-middle-class family home. They take place over 3 distinct periods of time, and their central character, or characters in this case, seem totally devoid of the kind of human emotion you would expect in a narrative feature film. The film begins with the S family silently taking their car through an automated car wash. Their faces are obscured, but it's easy to tell that there are three members of this family, later introduced as the father, George, the mother, Anna, and their daughter, Evie. As the car pulls out of the car wash, we linger on a travel agency advertisement for an Australian vacation, a haunting image of desert sand, large stones, and a peaceful beach. The film itself gets its title from Australia, also known as the Seventh Continent. The first act of the film takes place in 1987, and in the opening 20 minutes, we never really get a clear look at any of the family's faces. Instead, like Jeanne Dielman, the camera seems disinterested in any kind of coverage or clear character composition. Even though The Seventh Continent's runtime is far shorter than typical films considered slow cinema, it still counts as part of the genre and the methods used to tell the story. Haneke is far more interested in the textures and tone of the film, allowing ample time for the audience to formulate their own understanding of the family's dynamic, and perhaps contemplate their own. The editing and camera work build a mosaic of a family's life through small, mundane actions, foregrounding the moments which, in other movies, would happen in between the scenes. For example, when the daughter Evie attends a gymnastics lesson, the only shot we get is a long sequence in close-up of the students jumping over a hobby horse with no further context before or after. At breakfast, we watch the family's hands prepare their plates, but we never see their faces or hear much in the way of conversation. The family is defined by their actions, and those actions are the mundane routines of family life. They each perform their functions without thought or emotion, rarely ever speaking to each other at all. When they do speak to each other, it's in this disconnected chatter. The first act represents the family as a well-oiled machine, and in voiceover, we hear Anna read a letter she's written to George's parents. She updates them on how well their son has been doing in his business, how mindful and curious their granddaughter has become, and how hard it's been for Anna since her mother passed away. Anna reveals that her brother was sent to the hospital for a while due to his mental illness and his grieving, but he's recently returned to help with the family business. Each of these films represent the political interests of their time. For Andrei Rublev, the focus is on the interpretations, political and religious, we can have concerning the history of our culture. That film was made in a time of political strife and religious upheaval in the Soviet Union, and the film's themes reflect that friction through the observational eye of a godlike camera. Jeanne Dielman's concern is that of sexual liberation and gender equality, trapping us into the life of a repressed woman's daily routine. The Seventh Continent, coming in at the tail end of the 80s, is a reaction to the rampant consumerism and the emotional disconnect of living in the modern world. By the time we see the faces of the S family, the first act is almost over. But we've had plenty of time to see their possessions. We've observed them shop for food, interact with electronics, listen to news bulletins on their TV, have a bountiful, largely uneaten breakfast, and wash their nice new car. The S family isn't defined by their relationships with each other or with their family, but instead by how they interact with their possessions. Haneke uses the filmic language of slow cinema to present non-narrative, sculptural tableau. It tells a story the way a painting tells a story. The Seventh Continent, in its first act, is more akin to an inverted, subverted Norman Rockwell painting than a feature film. In the first piece of traditional narrative, roughly 30 minutes into the film, the S daughter, Evie, is carried from the school bathroom to the hall. The school teacher sits her down and asks her what's wrong, and Evie reveals she's gone blind. After a few questions, the teacher discovers Evie is lying. We then, immediately, learn that Evie's mother is an optometrist. Anna confronts Evie about lying at school, and she convinces Evie to tell her the truth by lying to her.
Du brauchst keine Angst haben, ich tue dir nichts bestimmt. Es ist wahr. Hast du dich blind gestellt?
At dinner, pop music plays loudly. And when George turns it down, Anna's brother, who is visiting, begins to cry. Before bed, Anna asks Evie if she ever feels lonely. And then we see this. Part 2 of the film takes place 1 year later, and the family seems to be the same. We follow their routine again, and just like Jeanne Dielman, something seems off. Another voiceover from Anna reads a letter to George's parents, where she expresses how well the family is doing now that George has finally gotten his big promotion. But as the voiceover plays, we see Anna waiting to see the doctor. The dissonance between what we're seeing on screen and what we're hearing Anna say informs the many contradictions of the second act. George and his former boss have a polite, emotionless conversation which would, in a normal movie, be fraught with tension. Here, though, the characters express nothing but cursory, necessary dialogue and politeness. In fact, every scene which would normally be mined for drama or conflict is stripped of these very qualities, constantly subverting the expectations of an audience hungry for some kind of narrative. That night, on their way to the car wash, the S family passes a gruesome car accident. Once they're in the car wash, Anna starts to sob. But George doesn't seem to know how to console her. He presses his fingers awkwardly against her cheek, and her hand searches for Evie's in the back seat. While Jeanne Dielman uses its runtime to give the audience a real-time account of a person's daily actions, Haneke uses these long takes here to reinforce the dehumanization of the S family. In all of this time, and in all of these rote motions, the characters never truly reveal themselves. They aren't just represented by their actions, they are their actions. There's nothing else there but blankness for the audience to connect with. The vacuum of normality invites viewers to fill in their own information about what may be going on, and the film offers no easy solutions or answers. The first two acts of The Seventh Continent don't lull the audience into a false sense of comfort the way Jeanne Dielman does. Dielman's daily chores are oddly compelling and hypnotic in their precision, washing over the viewers the way comforting YouTube videos might. The Seventh Continent is never comfortable, even in its opening calmness. Our disengaged relationship to these characters, who appear only as hands in the early scenes, never forms throughout the film. Each scene is instead an act of defamiliarization. In spaces where conversation should be lively, people are silent. Where there should be love and security, there's self doubt and isolation. When pieces of narrative should be doled out, we are met with eerie silence. Like the car wash the family uses in each act, the family itself feels just like an automated collection of systems running through endless cycles. Part 3 fast forwards us to 1989, and it operates like an excruciating version of the murder scene in Jeanne Dielman. The voiceover introducing the final act doesn't come from Anna, but from George, who seems to have awoken from whatever slumber he was in for the first two parts. But immediately, something is very different. We watch with basically no context as the family spends the last 40 minutes of the film disconnecting completely from the outside world. George sells his car, buys some power tools, and quits his job. Anna writes a note to Evie's school saying she is sick and won't be back for a while. Anna gives her half of the optometrist office to her brother. At the grocery store, Anna orders a feast, but when the clerk asks if she's having a party or planning a wedding, Anna says no. At the bank, Anna explains to the teller that they need all of their savings in cash as they're moving to Australia. At the house, it becomes clear soon enough what Anna and George are planning. The cinematic language Haneke used earlier, close ups of hands performing tasks, is returned to here in this third act. But instead of watching the hands make a meal or complete chores, we watch as they destroy art, stereo equipment, furniture, clothes, and everything else in the house. To echo Jhumpa Lahiri's sentiments regarding Jeanne Dielman, the audience cannot bear the idea of the film ending, of the inevitable happening. In a film which has to this point performed no work in terms of storytelling or plotting, we're given a clear focus for how things are about to go. Hanukkah employs discordant montage for several minutes as scissors, power tools, and hammers deconstruct every item the S family owns. The rest of the story is perhaps too bleak for this platform, but you can probably see where the plot is taking us. The S family will not only destroy their possessions, but they also plan to destroy themselves. Michael Haneke based this film on a news story he read in the newspaper about a family that was found in their home, surrounded completely by their destroyed possessions. The Seventh Continent is one of the darkest and bleakest films I have ever seen. Unlike Andrei Rublev or Jeanne Dielman, there is no meditative state in this film. Instead, Haneke weaponizes the filmic language of slow cinema from the very beginning, foregrounding human activity not as a means of humanizing and empathizing with characters in real time, but as a way of alienating the audience through defamiliarizing the family unit. The seventh continent moves glacially because we are never allowed to be comfortable. Scenes start and stop without purpose. Dialogue only delivers meaningless information, and we are never allowed to enter the inner circle of why these characters behave the way they do. The film's language is its theme. The isolation we feel as viewers from the characters of this film mirror the emotional distance the family itself feels from the society in which they live. The film conveys no meaning to their actions because, in their points of view, their actions have no meaning. And since they are their actions, they themselves have no meaning. Here, Haneke employs the language of slow cinema to defamiliarize the most familiar thing about being human: family life. If Jeanne Dielman is a film about wasted time, then The Seventh Continent is a film about disconnection. Why do we perform the daily grind of life? Why do we keep buying these things which don't make us happy? Why don't we actually go on that trip to Australia? Why don't we make time to see our families? In the final moments of The Seventh Continent, George's eyes are illuminated by the white noise of the TV, which makes the same sound as the car wash at the beginning of the film. Another automatic thing, devoid of meaning, full of sound and fury, but signifying nothing. Tetris has been re released, remastered, and repackaged hundreds of times, but the basic rules remain the same. Live in the moment, and don't linger for too long. Another block is coming, and this one looks faster. While Tetris doesn't have the traditional storytelling or character associated with modern video games, the rote actions of the game itself appeal to audiences around the world because of the friction it produces between comfort and anxiety. We go to the game for the mundane simplicity it offers, but the game must end with one final anxious push. Andrei Rublev, Jeanne Dielman, and The Seventh Continent are only 3 examples of slow cinema, a surprisingly diverse subgenre utilized by filmmakers from around the world. While these 3 films primarily focus on bleak subject matter, plenty of slow cinema films with happier messages are out there, like Ryosuke Hamaguchi's Happy Hour, a 5-hour film about good friends, or Park Lanes, an 8-hour real-time documentary chronicling a full shift at a bowling pin manufacturing center. While it's not cinema, I would also characterize Animal Crossing as a form of slow media, like ambient music or a Robert Wilson play. These are examples of art focused more on texture and experience than traditional narrative. However, when the original Animal Crossing was released on the Nintendo GameCube in North America, the main selling point of the game in every advertisement was that the game was alive, even when you weren't playing it. Using your GameCube's internal clock and calendar, Animal Crossing was able to keep track of the holidays and your frequency of entering the game space. If you neglected to play the game for a day or for a few days, cobwebs would start to grow in your house. Other characters would express concern or frustration about your absence. There, too, is that friction between comfort and anxiety. In that friction is the game itself and its emergent stories. In essence, the game takes away your control of time. Even there, in that video game populated by cute animals and soothing music, time is unstoppable. Unless you change the clock in your GameCube. That's fine. You can also do that.